The sea green dress stared back at me from the closet like a photograph of another life. I had worn it to Claire's high school awards night, to her university graduation under that blue cap and gown, and later to toast her promotion at a small boutique agency downtown. Each time she leaned close and said, "Mom, you look so elegant," like it was a benediction. Now, as I smoothed the hem over my shoulders and felt the quiet give of fabric over the 63 years I carry, I found myself wondering if tonight would be the last time I dressed like I meant anything to her. 3 weeks had passed since the fight that shredded the seams of our family. $72,000. That was the figure Claire and her fiancé, Mark, had told me I would provide. Not suggested, not asked, told. As if the life insurance my Peter left, the small cushion we'd saved and guarded for the years when work slowed and the knees got stiff, was a check to be cashed for their starts and stops. "You're being selfish," Claire had said flatly, her voice like a winter branch snapping. "You're sitting on that money while we build our lives. Don't you want me to be happy?" I tried to explain that happiness didn't require imported granite or a honeymoon in Santorini. I offered $12,000. Enough for a lovely local ceremony, flowers, a band. It was a generous offer for someone who'd been a single earner by choice for decades. But Claire's gaze had been a stranger's, sharp, calculating, cold. And in that stare, I could not find the child who once bound dandelions into crowns and called them the sun. The call came on a warm Thursday, as I knelt between the tomato plants in the tiny yard I moved to after Peter passed. Claire's voice was softer than usual, the edges rounded, vulnerable. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we both dug our heels in. Can we have dinner? I want to fix this." My chest unclenched. Possibly the silence had worked on her. Perhaps pregnancy, she told me then she was 3.5 months along, had tilted something in her toward understanding sacrifice. "I'd like that, dear," I said, envisioning the old comfortable bridge, the risotto I'd make, the gentle way I'd name the things that mattered more than money. "We were thinking of taking you somewhere special," she said. "You remember La Scala on Elmbridge? That little place your Peter took you to for your 30th? Nice and quiet." I could see it. The brick face, the window boxes, the gauze curtains, the kind of lighting that hides the small tremor of grief. Hope, like a moth, fluttered against my ribs. Maybe this was the start of the mending I wanted. The drive there took me past the elementary school where I used to shelve picture books, past the playground where I pushed Claire in the summer and cut my palm on a rusty swing, past the municipal hall where I taught her to take ballroom steps for her first prom. Each place was a well-worn page of a story I wasn't sure I wanted to turn. La Scala sat as if time had kept the reservation for me. The hostess led me to a corner table where Claire already sat, cheeks soft with pregnancy, her hair falling in an expensive, effortless wave. She wore a dress I didn't recognize. Lovely, probably the sort of price tag I thought about, and then put back. She stood to hug me, for a second breathing in her perfume. I felt the old maternal tide sweep in, the refrain of 35 years that had defined me. Protector, witness to everything. "You look wonderful," I told her, meaning it. "How are you feeling? Any morning sickness?" "Better now," she said, smoothing a hand over the small rounded place at her center, both tender and territorial. "Mark should be here. He's stuck at the office." When Mark arrived, he did not come alone. He came with 3 men in dark suits carrying folders. I could feel the room tilt. Where comfort should have been, a thin edge of something rehearsed slid into the air. Mark's smile was a showman's. Perfect. Calibrated. "Mrs. Hale," he said with a practiced brightness. "Thank you for coming." He introduced the men as colleagues, and I listened to the soft footsteps settle around our table like a coronation for a trap. "Claire? Who are they?" I asked, and the word came out careful, like stepping off a curb I hadn't seen. "They've got some paperwork to look at," Claire answered, unable to meet my eyes. One man, grey at the temples, leaned forward and offered his hand. "Mrs. Hale, I'm Alan Pierce. I'm Mark's counsel. We've prepared documents that will be beneficial to all parties." The phrase hung there, polished and false. My throat tightened, but this time fury didn't lead. Something cooler, a brittle, glassy clarity, slithered in. "What kind of documents?" I asked. Alan smiled with teeth that had learned to do the work of persuasion. "Power of attorney arrangements," he said. "Given your age and the fact you live alone now, it would be sensible for someone younger to manage investments, property, insurance. You wouldn't want the burden, Mrs. Hale?" "My age?" I repeated. "I am 63, not 93. He patted the folder as if it were a friend. "These things are complicated. Markets, taxes, real estate. Isn't it easier to let someone more involved handle them?" Across the table, my daughter sat like a statue. I looked for a sign that this was not her arrangement, but she folded her hands and stared at the linen as if it might explain itself. Alan slid a manila folder across the table. "If you could sign here and initial there, we can get things in order tonight." I opened it, although my hands already knew the contents. Powers of attorney granting control of bank accounts, title, insurance, the lot. Everything Peter and I had threaded together for 40 years. If I didn't sign, what then? My voice came out level despite the quake inside. Claire lifted her head, and for a moment I saw something I'd never seen. Something final. "You won't see your grandson grow up," she said simply. "It's your choice. We've been advised that grandparents' rights are limited if a parent restricts access, especially if the grandparent is difficult." The world around me fell away. The soft jazz, the murmurs of other dinners, the clink of silverware. And I found myself facing the biography of my life, distilled into this small, bright moment. I dug through my bag for my phone, found the number I needed, called the son I trusted. "Tom," I said when he answered, "I need you at La Scala, now." The silence that followed felt taut. Mark's confident mask flickered. The lawyers exchanged a scent of impatience. Mom, Claire, tried, in that adolescent sing-song she'd perfected for tantrums. "You don't have to bring Tom into this. This is between us." I folded my hands in my lap and felt steadier than I expected. "Funny," I said, "that when you call a dinner a reconciliation, you bring 3 lawyers. Alan leaned in pleasantly. "Mrs. Hale, perhaps we should step somewhere more private. Family matters can be emotional." "How thoughtful," I said. "I'll give you a number. 25 minutes. That's how long it takes Tom to get here if he hits every green." Light. It gave us time, and it bought me the chance to name the moment. Mark tried soothing, and I asked pointedly, "And this help managing my affairs, how much does it cost?" The attorneys stiffened like predators surprised to see sharpness in their prey. They muttered about administrative fees and security and the baby. Claire touched her belly as if it were a talisman. "When did you decide to stage this?" I asked. "We've been discussing options for weeks," she said, chin up, stubborn that old Peter trait in a new, harder shape. You said you didn't care about my future. Is that what we call extortion now? I asked quietly. Voices tittered in nearby booths. I could feel eyes on us like wind. A younger lawyer, suddenly nervous, offered an opinion about grandparents' rights. They're limited in this state, ma'am. If the parent restricts access. A warm voice cut through from behind me. Mrs. Hale? You called me? Tom stood, there in scrubs, hair askew, looking like the son who once used to balance my dinner plates for me while I tended to bills. He sat after a slight nod and scanned the scene as if assessing trauma. He picked up the folder, flipped through it. Power of attorney. Did you ask for this, Mom? No, I said. He closed the folder with a soft authority that made the men at the table shift. Mark, Claire, gentlemen, step over there for a minute. The older lawyer tried to protest. Tom's voice was calm steel. I'm not asking. When? They skirted to the bar, quiet and unnatural. He leaned across and lowered his voice. Mom, tell me everything. I unspooled for him what I could. The figure, the pressure, Claire's ultimatum. He listened, then, as if summoned, a light went on inside him. How much? He asked. 72,000, I said. He whistled a low, incredulous sound. And you offered 12? He said. You did more than any mother ought to be asked for. Did they push you? Talk to neighbors? Ask about your memory? His questions came with the clinical focus of a man used to reading heart monitors and people. I almost laughed. I balanced my checkbook down to pennies, renegotiated insurance to save $300 last year, caught a county billing error that shaved nearly $1,000 off a tax assessment. Do I sound like someone who needs my affairs managed? I asked, squeezed my hand. You taught me how to count, how to work. That's why I'm here. He turned his gaze to Claire, the question in his eyes heavy. When did my daughter swap tenderness for transactions? Maybe Mark put the idea in her head, I admitted, watching Mark at the other table, the way his posture sliced space. Even from there you could see how he measured rooms and people for value. Tom covered my hand with his and said, She's 34. She makes her choices. What do you want to do? Before I could answer, Mark returned, the lawyers trailing, after like trained dogs. Claire trailed slower, one hand protective atop her stomach. We're on a timeline, Mark said, smooth as Riverstone. 3 months until the wedding. Vendors need deposits. Timeline, I repeated, allowing the word to hang. The restaurant hummed around us, people living ordinary, small lives. I've decided, I said, the voice carrying. I'll sign. For a split beat, the relief eased Mark's shoulders, eased the attorneys' faces into something like satisfaction. Then I reached for my phone. There's someone else who wants to say a few words, I said. I dialed a number I'd saved 2 weeks earlier, a safeguard after the first demand, the day my spine first tingled with suspicion. Marlene Quinn? I said when the voice answered. Can you come to La Scala? Bring those files. Mark's expression tightened from triumph to confusion to alarm as he processed the new variable. Who is Marlene? He stammered. My lawyer, I replied, keeping the calm my years had taught me to wear. Heads turned. The smugness in Alan Pierce's face drained away like rain off glass. I laid out the small manila envelope I'd been keeping ready. Photographs Mark had taken of my house. Printouts of emails between him and a private investigator. Copies of snooped medical queries and notes from neighbors. The men's skin paled as the paper hit the table. Apparently, the private investigator hadn't been as discreet as Mark hoped. Marlene arrived 12 minutes later with the kind of steady stride that comes from decades in courtrooms. She was in her 70s, small and efficient, and she carried a file like someone who knew how to finish a chore. "Claire," she said warmly, settling into the spare chair Tom had arranged. The room shifted. Predators realized suddenly they were prey. "Mrs. Hale," Marlene said after she took in the scene. "I hear there are documents to sign." She opened a folder and slid papers across the table. "Before any power of attorney arrangement is discussed, you should see what Mrs. Hale has already done." I felt Mark lean in as if to grab a hope. The papers were stamped. Official. The Evergreen Family Trust, established 2 weeks earlier. All assets, house, investment accounts, and the life insurance had been moved into a trust. Beneficiaries, my children, born and unborn. Trustee, Tom until the youngest reaches 25. As Mark scanned the trust, he went the color of a man calculating lost density. "What about the wedding?" he barked. "What about our expenses?" Marlene looked at him like a surgeon looks at a tumor. "The trust provides for education, medical care, reasonable living for beneficiaries," she said. "I'm not seeing Italian marble as an educational expense." "You can't do this to Claire," he protested. "You can't cut her out over a wedding." "I'm not cutting her out," I said flatly. "I'm protecting her inheritance from people who see me as a resource." Marlene's smile was the one that wins arguments, compact and knowing. "Mr. Adams," she said, "you should consult counsel of your own. You may have some awkward questions to answer about the investigations you commissioned into your fiancé's mother." Alan gathered his papers. The other lawyers murmured about misunderstandings and postponements. They excused themselves. Pockets, lighter for the retreat. I took my time standing. The dust the argument had thrown up settled like a hush. Claire's tears came then, silent or maybe strategic, and I let them be. "When you're ready for an honest conversation," I told her, "call me. Alone." To Mark I said simply, "Keep away from my family and my home. Try one more inquiry about my competence, and Marlene and I will see you in a very different place." Tom paid the bill, tucked some cash into Alan's hand like a bandage on a bruise. And as we left the restaurant, Mark's protests rose behind us and were swallowed by the city evening. Marlene asked me on the sidewalk how I felt. "Free," I said after thinking. Those weeks of being treated like a project rather than a person had been a slow kind of strangling. Now, for the first time in months, my chest felt like it had room to breathe. 3 weeks later, the mornings in my kitchen looked different. The sun made the linoleum glow in the old patterns Peter had always liked. I had a neighbor now, Janet Reed, who knocked with a casserole dish, and the chuckle of someone who liked small talk and larger truths. She'd appeared like a good fortune, a widowed retired school secretary who'd moved into the duplex next door. She had the kind of clear eyes that read people gently and the patience to let gossip become justice. "Mark was at the bank yesterday," she told me over coffee. "Accounts frozen. Some partner trouble." The news filled whatever jagged pleasure there is in seeing consequence unfold without you having to do the delivering. "And Claire?" I asked, curious in a way that felt new. "She's shopping for dresses," Janet said. "And that marble renovation? On hold." We sat and let the ordinary world carry on. Kids and cars, laundry and mail. Weeks had taught me that revenge tastes sweeter when it's the universe doing the serving, when you don't have to dirty your hands. A phone call buzzed my kitchen counter later that day. Tom's voice, weathered with worry. Claire had called him, asking if she was making a mistake. He'd told her, as he always does, that money-driven choices rarely bring the comfort people expect, and that if she wanted to repair things, she had to begin by telling the truth. She'd hung up. Little by little, the evidence mounted that Claire was choosing a marriage that put ledger lines before love. Each call, each overheard conversation, each small manipulative maneuver confirmed the same thing. Protecting myself was not maliciousness, it was survival. Janet and I started going out to see places she'd always wanted to visit. I joined the Willow Community Center's seniors group that took calls from women who'd been pressured by their children to liquidate to live. I found in the work a new steady purpose: help others see themselves again when their identities had been reduced to bank accounts. Marlene became a legend locally. She set up protective trusts for neighbors, helped file elder abuse complaints, and returned money to victims who'd been robbed of dignity. Then the call came that spun me sideways. Claire had delivered. A granddaughter, 7 pounds, and small as an argument. The name she and Mark chose was a near echo of my own mother's. A soft, deliberate pick that landed like a question. Tom said Claire asked him to call me, to tell me I could visit. My first instinct was to rush, to take the infant into my arms and let blood make amends. But I had learned to test my impulses. Were they mine, or were they being used as a lever? Marlene said she could arrange supervised visits through Tom, with clear protocols. No discussion of the trust, no baiting, defined lengths, and immediate end of contact if the rules were broken. That seemed fair. I wrote a calm letter to Claire. Love the child. We'll meet under certain conditions. Visits arranged through Tom. Any attempt to reopen finances ends the visit. I mailed it and put the action of the letter into my bones, like medicine. Time shaped itself differently. I volunteered at the community center, turning the raw embers of my own betrayals into warm light for others. The weekly circle grew. Maxine, energetic at 72, who said life after betrayal is a new kind of living. Rosa, who had fought her son's gambling for years. Eddie, who learned after his daughter drained his retirement that solitude can be chosen and sweet. People came for resources, legal guidance, and, more than anything, the permission to be both angry and tender. At a meeting one evening, a new woman asked the question I had been carrying like a stone. How do you stop missing the person they used to be? The truth came out in my voice, plain and unvarnished. You don't stop missing them. You learn to mourn what they were while protecting yourself from what they are. Grief and boundaries can live in the same house. Weeks turned into months. Claire visited the meetings, ostensibly to learn about exploitation. Really? I think she wanted to see me in a different context, to be allowed back in without the negotiations. She wanted the warmth without the terms. Tom came by to run through psychological ideas with the group, helping people unhook guilt from responsibility. Marlene and I began running seminars on financial literacy for women who'd never had to make the calls or balance the books. Little by little, I discovered a new vocation, teaching women to make decisions that belong to them. A few months later, a woman in the circle, she had the brittle politeness of someone used to having borrowed lives, asked me what comes next. I looked around at faces that had watched me unravel and then stitch myself new. Purpose, I said. For years, my purpose had been others. Marriage, motherhood, tending what Peter and I built. Protecting it felt natural. Now purpose took a different shape, saving other mothers from the same slow theft of agency, helping them put locks on doors and policies on accounts and armor on their voices. There was a satisfaction in that work that hurt in the right way. And yes, sometimes I still missed Claire. the little girl with dandelions and sunlit hair. I allowed myself that private morning, but the new life had edges that held me steady. There were trips with Janet we'd planned, a museum in Nashville she'd wanted to see, and afternoons at the center where we taught others how to notice the soft patterns of manipulation. When Claire's baby was small, Tom called me and said she'd asked if perhaps the trust could be re-examined. Irrevocable, Tom said, really means irrevocable. She asked whether I might change my mind if she ended the engagement. I told him what I had learned. Decisions cued by money rarely bring healing. If reconciliation was possible, it would begin with truth and accountability, not with bargaining over inheritances. I wrote another note to Claire when the time felt right, clear and calm, not the angry thing I'd drafted 100 times. I said I loved the child and would meet the baby under the conditions that kept both of us safe. I sealed it and sent it, feeling the small, enormous pleasure of setting terms with my own handwriting, not someone else's. The dress still hung in my closet. Sometimes I tried it on and thought of the woman who had walked into La Scala 3 months prior, who had left that night not a victim, but a woman who could not be moved. She was dangerous in the way that truth is dangerous to those who count on quiet compliance. 6 months after the confrontation, I stood in the community hall watching 12 people arrange chairs into the shape of a conversation. Maxine took a breath and smiled. Rosa placed tissues into the center. Claire came early that night and sat quietly, watching, sometimes participating, sometimes still the daughter I miss. She had learned some things, and some she had not. For me, the work had evolved into more than volunteering. It had become a consulting practice, helping women set up trusts, navigate court, teach neighbors to watch for the tiny patterns that can become life-shattering. Once a woman asked how to carry the sadness of someone who used to be a parent, a lover, a friend. I answered what I'd learned. You learn grief and boundaries at the same time. You give yourself permission to miss them and permission to protect yourself from them. You can hold both without shame. Life moved forward in small, surprising ways. Janet and I visited the museum. I found pleasure in grocery shopping without being watched, in choosing my own days. Claire's daughter, my granddaughter, grew in a nursery that had no ledger lines in the margins. I saw her across a glass during a supervised visit, and my heart folded and did what it always does. It loved. But I loved with a map now, not blind. If I had to name the greatest gift I could give that child, it was this, a model of a woman who kept herself whole, not perfect, not unfeeling, but someone who would not be occupied, priced, or negotiated, someone who withheld nothing from life except submission to theft. That I knew would outlast marble and honeymoons. The sea green dress remains in my closet, but it no longer holds the power it once did. It is a garment, like many things, that I can put on and take off. The woman I am now goes to dinners where she's invited to belong, and sometimes she sits alone in the kitchen, drinking coffee with Janet, planning a workshop, tending the tomatoes. The world of my life is quieter and stronger. The thing that happened at La Scala taught me the hard arithmetic of love. Some people measure worth in dollars. Some people measure it in presence. I chose presence. If Claire ever comes back with an honest heart, the door is not closed, but I will not let it be a revolving one for those who come only for the counting. I will love the daughter she was. I will protect the granddaughter she has. And I will keep teaching the women who sit in our circle how to say, without apology, this far and no farther. I kept expecting some great rupture, a dramatic return, a grand apology or a fresh betrayal that would yank the rug out from under me. Instead, life unfolded in small, stubborn increments, the kind you hardly notice until you look back and realize how far you've come. Spring arrived the following year, and with it a parade of tiny, ordinary moments that stitched themselves into a new way of living. I learned the names of the women who came every Tuesday to the community circle. June, who'd rediscovered her laugh. Marta, who finally opened a savings account on her own. Eddie, who taught us how to read contracts for hidden clauses. We added a small shelf of resources in the center. Flyers from legal aid, contact cards for accountants who did pro bono work, a list of trusted contractors. It felt like building a library for survival. Not a library of how to win against every scheme, but of how to stand up without losing your dignity. Claire called less often. When she did, her voice had the edges of someone learning repair work, with clumsy hands. Sometimes it was a voicemail asking about the baby's doctor. Sometimes it was a short text. "Is Michael bringing Ellie by Sunday?" I answered when it felt safe. I said yes when I could meet the terms. I said no when the ask felt like a negotiation wrapped in a lullaby. Mark's name stopped surfacing at meetings. The rumor mill supplied occasional updates about his business, troubles, and a messy accounting audit. And I found I felt a small, private relief when I heard setbacks had finally found him. Karma had a way of catching up without my involvement. Visits with my granddaughter took the shape of guarded joy. The first time I held Ellie, a name that sounded like the echo of 3 generations. I felt all the old instinctive electricity that comes with meeting someone you adore. The room smelled of baby lotion and hospital bleach. Tom stood nearby, steady as ever. Claire sat across from me, hands clasped, trying to read my face. We sat with a script. Michael there, Tom moderating, no talk of trusts, no questions about money. It was not the romantic scene of fairy tales. It was a beginning decided in practical language. I learned to let the small, perfect things matter. The slope of her cheek, the way she grasped my finger like a promise. Claire and I had dinners where we ate the same food and said different words. Sometimes she talked about prenatal classes or the odd thing babies do in the night. Sometimes she apologized in that roundabout way people do when they're still learning humility. Not a single sweeping apology, but a string of small ones. For the timing, for the hurt, for the fear. I answered with the kind of forgiveness that's not a blanket. It's a roadmap. "I accept that you are changing," I told her once. "But I need you to accept that I am too." She nodded, the way people nod when they are holding both, truth and sorrow. Work at the center grew. What began as a weekly support circle folded outward into workshops with local libraries and churches. I found myself teaching other women how to set up basic protections, how to make an emergency folder, where to store passwords, what red flags to watch for when a loved one starts to request money. Marlene and I hosted a session that drew a crowd. Afterward, a woman in her late 50s pressed my hand and said, "I thought I was the only one." That quiet admission was the thing that gave me purpose more often than applause ever did. There were setbacks, of course. Claire would have days where old expectations leaked back in, where generosity and entitlement tangled and she pushed too far. I learned to execute consequences without cruelty. A cancelled visit, a calm text reminding her of the agreement. Each time I enforced a boundary, a new, firmer piece of my life took root. There is an art to being compassionate and immovable at once. I practiced it daily. Months later, when Ellie took her first unsteady steps across my living room, with Janet clapping, behind her and Tom beaming in the doorway, I had the ridiculous pleasure of feeling both proud and vindicated, not because I'd won anything from anyone, but because I had stayed in my center long enough to see a child learning the world and trust that the world could be kinder than the choices that had hurt me. Claire and I never circled back to the simplicity of our old closeness. Some things don't return in the same shape, but what we developed was steadier. A relationship defined by limits and possibility. A fragile bridge built of careful conversations and shared grandparents' birthdays. She came to workshops once, twice. She brought a friend once who had been in a similar situation and listened with the focused sadness of someone just beginning to unlearn entitlement. As for Mark, life had a way of pruning people who only saw others as accounts. I heard from a woman at the center months later that his firm had been fined for irregularities and that his partner had left. I did not celebrate the news loudly. It felt petty to exult in someone else's fall. Instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice doing its slow work while I tended better things. A garden, friendships, a new syllabus for financial empowerment classes. There were evenings when grief slid through me for the woman Claire had been. I kept a photograph in my wallet of her at 7, face freckled and defiant, holding a crooked bouquet of dandelions. Those rare pangs softened with time, becoming a tender ache rather than a jagged ruin. I learned to grieve someone who was still alive, and then to welcome them into my life on terms that protected the parts of me that mattered most. Years folded forward. The circle at the center grew into something resilient, a ragged constellation of people who'd been betrayed, who'd reclaimed small pieces of themselves, and then gave those pieces back as tools for others. I taught now at local community, colleges, gave talks at women's groups, and consulted with legal aid on elder protection measures. My life, once defined by the safe arithmetic of marriage and savings, found new equations. How to live with dignity, how to give love without ceding yourself. Every so often, Claire and I would sit with Ellie between us, and we would watch her assemble blocks into castles, and then knock them down just to build again. Watching from across that small circle, I felt a fierce, uncomplicated love for the child, and a calm certainty that the woman I had become was the best inheritance I could offer. Steadiness, boundaries, and a refusal to be diminished. The sea green dress still survives in my closet, relegated to the occasional memory of how things used to be. More often I wear comfortable things that allow me to kneel in gardens and stand in classrooms and clap at a child's first step. The woman who walked into La Scala that night is still inside me. She taught me how to say no and mean it. But the woman who now sits at those Tuesday circles and teaches other women how to name exploitation and build a life afterward, she is the truer version, the quieter, more dangerous kind of power that doesn't need spectacle to prove itself. If Claire ever finds her way fully back, not because of guilt or pressure, but because she learns what it means to be generous beyond material things, I will welcome her, not into the old pattern, not into a ledger, but into a conversation started with honesty. Until then, I will keep doing the small, stubborn work of living a life that is mine, gardening, teaching, loving on my terms. And when Ellie runs into my arms, as she does now, with a laugh that untempered makes the house shine, I will hold her and let the quiet joy of a life reclaimed be enough. By the time Ellie turned 3, the world had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Again, ordinary, but never the same. Tuesday nights were still for the community center. The room smelled of coffee and purpose, a blend of floral lotion, paper, and quiet resilience. The folding chairs always arranged in a circle, never rows, because that was our rule. We didn't stand in front of each other anymore. We sat with each other. Equals. Survivors. Builders. We'd outgrown the named support group. What we had now was a network. A living, breathing coalition of people who'd learned that family wounds don't make you weak. They make you wise in ways you never asked to be. That night, as I set out the handouts Marlene had printed, Janet was already chatting with Rosa near the door. "You've heard?" she said when I passed. "Heard what?" I asked, settling the stack on the table. "Claire," she said softly, the way people say a name they know might still bruise. "She left Mark. For good this time." The words landed like the quiet thud of something I didn't know I'd been waiting for. I felt no surge of triumph, no I told you so kind of satisfaction, only the heavy, complicated weight of inevitability. "Was it bad?" I asked. "Bad enough," Janet said. "Financial trouble, something with his firm again. He's under investigation." I nodded, the motion small, deliberate. That was the thing about time. It didn't erase. It revealed. Sooner or later, character shows its receipts. Halfway through the meeting, I saw her, Claire, standing just inside the doorway. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the effortless shine she'd once worn like armor. Her eyes searched the room, and when they found mine, there was something raw there. Not pride, not defiance, something closer to surrender. "Mom," she said quietly. Just that. Every chair turned. I could feel 30 eyes watching the air between us. The group knew our story. Versions of it, at least. They knew this was not just a visit. It was an earthquake disguised as a moment. I stood slowly, gave her a small nod, and motioned her in. "Come sit," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. She did. Not next to me, not across from me, but in the open seat 2 chairs down. Just close enough to listen. We didn't talk that evening. Not during the meeting, not after. She sat quietly, taking notes like a student, auditing her own mistakes. When it ended, she lingered as others filtered out. Rosa patting her shoulder, Janet giving me a knowing glance before slipping away. "Are you angry?" she asked finally. The question was so small, it almost broke me. "No," I said truthfully, "not anymore." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I thought I could fix everything," she whispered. "Mark. He said he could take care of things, that he understood money better than I ever could, and I believed him." "I know," I said. "Believing the wrong person isn't a crime. It's just expensive." A soft, humorless laugh escaped her. "I lost so much, Mom." "Then start with what you still have," I said. "Your child, your health, your chance to learn different." Her gaze flickered to me, tentative. "And you?" "I'm here," I said simply. That night I sat at home long after she left, staring at the burgundy folder where I kept the trust papers. I realized I didn't resent it anymore. It wasn't a shield between us. It was a boundary. And boundaries, I had learned, are not walls. They are bridges with gates. They open when people arrive with respect. Weeks passed. Claire started showing up regularly, first as a quiet participant, then as a helper, then as someone who began sharing her story, haltingly at first. The first time she spoke, she said, "I thought controlling someone meant protecting them. I thought love looked like having the upper hand. It doesn't. It looks like accountability, and I didn't have any." The room listened in silence. It was the kind of confession that made others weep because it was not about crime or punishment, but about awakening. Over time, she rebuilt her life the way I had rebuilt mine, one careful piece at a time. She took a job at a local nonprofit that offered financial literacy to single mothers. She learned budgeting from the same worksheets she'd once mocked me for keeping. And Ellie, she grew into a bright, curious child who loved books and mud, puddles with equal fervor. She'd sit in my garden while I weeded and ask questions that only 3-year-olds and philosophers could invent. "Grandma, how do you fix a heart?" she asked once solemnly, after burying a broken dandelion stem. "You grow around it," I told her, "like roots." Claire started joining us for coffee on Sundays. The first few times, conversation was thin. Talk of weather, of Ellie's milestones. Then gradually, the silence stopped being defensive and became companionable. One morning, she said, "I found your letter again, the one you wrote about boundaries." She paused. It saved me. Not because it was kind, because it was clear, and that, I realized, was the full circle. Clarity had replaced closeness for a while, but in time, it became the seed of a different kind of closeness, one that didn't need debt or duty to stay alive. The community circle kept expanding, and sometimes when newcomers arrived, I would watch Claire quietly greet them at the door, hand them coffee and say, "You're safe here. You won't be judged." I never interrupted, never claimed the story as mine. She was learning to speak, her own truth, the way I had learned to speak mine. One evening, after everyone had gone, she stayed behind, stacking chairs. "Mom," she said, "you know that dress? The sea green one? I saw it in your closet last week. You should wear it again. Maybe when Ellie starts school." I laughed. "Why?" "Because it reminds me of the woman who didn't give up. On herself," she said. "I think she'd like to come to the first day of kindergarten." I looked at her, my daughter, not the version who had betrayed me, not the one who had apologized, but the one standing here now, wiser, scarred, growing. And I thought, maybe we both did. So yes, when September came, I wore the dress. Ellie ran into her classroom, fearless. Claire stood beside me, holding my hand, not out of obligation, but out of choice. And as the bell rang and the children disappeared into a room painted with sunshine and crayon drawings, I realized the most astonishing thing of all. Healing doesn't return you to who you were before the hurt. It turns you into someone who can love better, starting with yourself. 5 years later, my garden had changed again, so had I. The rose bushes Peter planted decades ago had long since grown wild, spilling over the fence like they'd decided beauty was better when it ignored borders. I let them. Some things deserve to take up more space when they've survived the pruning. I'd retired from the community center the year before, at least officially. Retired in the same way a mother retires from caring. Technically, never. The Tuesday Circle now ran itself, led by younger women who'd once come to cry and stayed to lead. I still stopped by, mostly to listen, to see how far a single ripple could travel once you'd thrown your story into the water. Claire was one of those ripples. She ran the financial empowerment branch now, partnered with Marlene's firm. Together, they'd built something neither of us had planned. A small network that offered legal aid, budgeting classes, and something even rarer. Hope that didn't sound like pity. Sometimes I'd watch her from the back of the room, hair pinned up, speaking with the same conviction I'd once used to scold her for missing curfew. "Money," she'd say to a room full of strangers, "isn't love. Control isn't care. Protection isn't ownership. And every time I'd see the room fall quiet, as if each person was realizing, all at once, that what they'd been, calling love was sometimes just fear dressed nicely. Ellie, now 8, would run around the edges of those events with crayons and determination, drawing the world the way she saw it. People holding hands, gardens full of flowers, a big yellow sun that never quite fit on the page. One afternoon she found my old sea green dress in the closet. "Grandma," she said, dragging it out with both hands. "Is this the dress from the story Mommy tells at the meetings?" I smiled. "Yes, it is." She frowned, studying it. "Why did it make everyone so sad?" I crouched beside her, ran my hand over the faded fabric. "It didn't make anyone sad," I said. "It just remembered things that hurt before we knew how to stop them." She nodded, the way children do when they understand more than you think. "Can I wear it when I'm big?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself. "But only if you promise. Never to wear it for anyone who doesn't respect your no," she giggled. "Okay." Later that evening, Claire came by. We sat on the porch, sipping tea, the air heavy with honeysuckle, and that faint hum of peace that comes when you've stopped expecting the next battle. She watched Ellie through the window and smiled softly. "She found the dress," she said. "I know." I told her the story once, about the dinner, about how I forgot who my mother was for a while. "You remembered," I said. "That's what matters." Claire turned to me, her expression serious. "You know, for years I thought you were being cruel. That letter you wrote, the way you cut me off. I didn't understand that it was love in disguise. The hard kind." I reached across the table, covering her hand. "Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. And I had surrendered for too long." She nodded slowly. "I get it now." We sat in silence, the kind that's not empty but full. Full of things finally understood, of words no longer needed. As the sun dipped below the trees, Ellie ran out, waving a paper. "Grandma, look, I drew us." There we were. 3 women side by side, drawn in bold crayon strokes. Above us, a house, a garden, and a sky full of yellow. But there was one detail that made my throat tighten. A thin line connecting our hands, but none holding them tight. "Why aren't we holding hands?" I asked softly. "Because we don't have to," Ellie said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "We're already together." Claire's eyes met mine, and in that small, simple drawing, I saw what generations of women before us had never been allowed to learn, that love doesn't need to hold you down to keep you close. Months later, at the 10th anniversary of the community program, they surprised me with a plaque for teaching us that freedom can be inherited. I didn't make a speech. I'd said enough words in my life to fill a book. But I did tell them this. When I walked into that restaurant years ago, I thought I was losing my daughter. I didn't know I was finding myself. And finding yourself doesn't mean turning your back on the people you love. It means turning toward the kind of love that doesn't ask you to disappear. When the applause faded, I saw Claire standing in the back, holding Ellie, both of them smiling, and I thought, this is what survival looks like when you let it soften. Not a battle won, but a life rebuilt. That night, I hung the plaque beside the photo of Peter and me on our wedding day. The sea green dress, folded neatly nearby, felt less like a ghost and more like a witness. I still wear it sometimes, not for weddings or reconciliation dinners, but for mornings when I tend my garden, for afternoons when I teach, For evenings when I remind myself that the strongest women I know don't wear armor. They wear memory. And they never forget how to say no with grace. Was 20 when I finally understood the story behind the sea green dress. For most of my life, it hung in my grandmother's closet like a relic from another era. The kind of thing adults whispered about when they thought I wasn't listening. Mom called it the dress that changed everything. Grandma called it just fabric with a memory. I didn't ask questions for a long time. Maybe because in our family, certain stories were sacred, and some were heavy. But that summer, the one before I left for college, I found myself in Grandma's kitchen, helping her can peaches when she told me the truth. "Did I ever tell you?" she began, wiping her hands on a towel. "That this dress once taught 3 generations of women how to stop apologizing." I laughed, thinking she was teasing, but she wasn't smiling. And so, between boiling jars and the slow hum of the ceiling fan, she told me everything. The restaurant, the betrayal, the folder on the table, my mother's silence, my uncle's arrival like a storm, and the letter, the one that changed the course of our family forever. I stood there, listening, the way you do when you realize the people you love were once versions of themselves you never met. When she finished, she poured us both tea, her hands steady. "You come from women who learned boundaries the hard way," she said. "But you don't have to learn them through pain. That's the gift we're trying to pass down." That night, I found the dress again. It was lighter than I expected, soft from years of hanging, smelling faintly of lavender, and something old but clean, like resilience. I tried it on, the hem brushing my ankles, and caught my reflection in the mirror. For a moment, it felt like history, fitting itself over me. Not as a burden, but as a kind of protection. Mom found me standing there. She didn't scold me. She just leaned on the doorframe and said, "You look like her. You stand like her, too." I turned. Like who? Like the woman who stopped a whole generation of us from giving our power away. Mom didn't talk much about that night at the restaurant, but I'd seen what it had made of her. She was the kind of woman who triple-checked contracts, who said no without softening her voice. But she was also the mom who baked cookies for fundraisers and stayed up late helping me rewrite essays. The kind of woman who'd been broken once and rebuilt with both steel and softness. The next day, she and Grandma took me out for lunch. Not at La Scala, though that restaurant still stood, but at a small cafe with sun-yellow walls. Grandma wore her favorite linen blouse. Mom wore her cautious smile. I think they were both trying to memorize me, the way I was before the world had a chance to test me. "Before you go," Grandma said, "we wanted to give you something." She slid a thin box across the table. Inside, folded like a secret, was a piece of the sea green dress. Not the whole thing, just the sleeve, turned into a silk ribbon. "For what?" I asked. "For remembering," she said. "Not the pain, the strength." Mom reached across the table and covered my hand. "We've all lost something because we were afraid to say no. Don't let that be your story." The 3 of us sat, there in silence, generations linked not by blood, but by lesson. When I moved into my dorm that fall, I hung the ribbon beside my desk lamp, and every time I looked at it, every time I hesitated to speak up, to draw a line, to ask for better, I'd think of that night long ago when my grandmother refused to sign a piece of paper that would have erased her. The older I get, the more I see that my inheritance wasn't money or property or even legacy. It was permission. permission to take up space, permission to say enough, permission to love without losing myself. Now, whenever I visit home, Grandma still tends her wild roses, Mom still runs her workshops at the community center, and I still catch them both watching me like they're making sure the story continues in the right direction. Sometimes I think it will. Sometimes I think it already has. Because this, right here, right now, is what healing looks like when it survives long enough to become heritage. It looks like 3 women laughing around a kitchen table. It sounds like a no spoken without fear. And it feels like freedom stitched into silk, passed down quietly, from one steady hand to the next.